When we imagine Adolf Hitler in the final years of the Third Reich, most of us picture the Führer locked away in his Berlin bunker, surrounded by generals, sycophants and guards. But there was another group of people always at his side, women who worked as his secretaries. They typed his speeches, managed his correspondence, and often spent more time with him than anyone else outside his inner political circle. These women witnessed Hitler in his private moments, saw him in triumph and in despair, and in the last days of the war, some were even trapped with him in the underground Führerbunker. But what became of them after the fall of Nazi Germany? Today we're going to explore the lives of Hitler's secretaries after World War II and how history remembered or forgot them. First, it's important to understand the role these women played during the Third Reich. Unlike Hitler's closest generals or ministers, his secretaries had no political power. They were not architects of genocide, nor planners of war. Their duties were clerical, typing, dictation, and handling paperwork. But proximity to Hitler gave them an unusual perspective on the dictator. They became part of his daily life, and many described him as surprisingly polite and even charming in private. This contrast between the man they knew and the monster responsible for the Holocaust haunted some of them for the rest of their lives. Let's begin with one of the most famous, Traudl Junge. Born in Munich in 1920, Traudl Junge became Hitler's secretary in 1942, when she was only 22 years old. She worked closely with him for the rest of the war, and in April 1945, she was among the few who entered the Berlin Führerbunker. It was Junge who typed Hitler's last will and political testament, only hours before his suicide. When the Soviets stormed Berlin, Junge managed to escape the bunker disguised as a civilian. For weeks, she wandered through the ruined city before being captured by the Red Army. She spent several months in captivity, but unlike top Nazi officials, she was not considered a war criminal. After the war, she returned to civilian life, working as a secretary in Munich. But she carried with her a deep sense of guilt. In later years, Junge admitted that she had been politically naive during the Third Reich. She claimed she only realized the full scale of Nazi crimes after the war, saying, "I was young and I didn't know. But that does not excuse me. If I was that young, I should have tried to find out." For decades, she remained largely silent about her experiences, reluctant to speak publicly. But shortly before her death in 2002, she gave detailed interviews that became the basis for the documentary Blind Spot, Hitler's Secretary. Her testimony remains one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of life inside Hitler's inner circle. Another key figure was Christa Schroeder. Born in 1908, Schroeder joined Hitler's staff in 1933, only months after he seized power. She worked with him for more than a decade, and unlike Traudl Junge, she was older, experienced, and politically aware. Schroeder accompanied Hitler on his travels, typed many of his speeches, and was present during numerous high-level meetings. When Germany collapsed in 1945, she fled Berlin, only to be captured by American forces in Bavaria. She spent time in Allied custody, questioned about her role, but was eventually released since she had no direct involvement in Nazi crimes. After the war, she lived a quiet life, avoiding the spotlight. But like Junge, she eventually wrote down her memories. Her memoirs, published after her death in 1984, gave historians further insights into Hitler's daily routines and his obsessive work habits. Next, we have Gerda Christian, born Gerda Daranowski in 1913. She began working for Hitler in 1937, left for a few years after marrying a Luftwaffe officer, then returned to the Führer's staff in 1943. Like Junge, she was in the bunker during Hitler's final days. When Hitler committed suicide on April 30, 1945, Christian was among the small group of secretaries offered the chance to leave. Unlike Junge, she chose to stay a little longer, but eventually fled as the Soviet forces closed in. She was captured, interrogated, and later released. Her post-war life was much more private than Junge's. She never sought the spotlight, never published memoirs, and rarely gave interviews. Gerda Christian died in Düsseldorf in 1997, leaving behind only fragments of her story. Another lesser-known secretary was Johanna Wolf. Born in 1900, Wolf had been with Hitler longer than almost anyone else, joining his staff in 1929, years before the Nazis came to power. She was fiercely loyal, and Hitler trusted her deeply. Unlike the younger secretaries, Wolf was not in the Führerbunker at the very end. In April 1945, Hitler ordered her to leave Berlin, believing her too valuable to be trapped in the final battle. She was later captured by American forces and held for interrogation, but like the others, she was not charged with crimes. After the war, Johanna Wolf lived quietly in Munich, avoiding publicity until her death in 1985. There was also Else Krüger, born in 1915. Krüger became Martin Bormann's secretary, but she also worked closely with Hitler in the bunker. She was one of the last to leave before Berlin fell, escaping with Bormann in an attempt to break out of the city. While Bormann was likely killed during that escape, Krüger was captured by the Allies. Her life after the war took an unexpected turn. She later married a British intelligence officer and moved to the United Kingdom. She lived out her days far from Germany, passing away in 2005. Another figure worth mentioning is Gerda Daranowski's replacement during her absence, Kather Homan. She wasn't a secretary in the same sense as Junge or Schroeder, but she played an important role after the war. Homan was a dental assistant who worked for Hitler's dentist, Hugo Blaschke. When the Soviets captured Berlin, she was forced to help identify Hitler's remains through his dental records. For this, the Soviets accused her of collaboration and sentenced her to 10 years in a labor camp. She survived and eventually returned to Germany, but her life was marked by hardship because of her connection to Hitler's staff. So, what patterns emerge when we look at the lives of these women? First, none of Hitler's secretaries were tried as major war criminals. Unlike high-ranking Nazis, they were not decision-makers. They were considered witnesses rather than perpetrators. But this didn't free them from moral questioning. Many later reflected on their blindness to the crimes happening around them, admitting they ignored uncomfortable truths. Traudl Junge, in particular, became almost a symbol of this willful ignorance, someone who was just doing her job while atrocities unfolded in the background. Second, most of them lived quiet, modest lives after the war. Some married, some worked ordinary jobs, and most avoided publicity. It was only late in life, often near death, that some chose to speak out. And third, their stories remind us of the complexity of history. These women were not monsters, but neither were they innocent bystanders. They lived in the shadow of one of history's greatest criminals, shared his daily life, and typed the words that fueled his regime. Their survival into the post-war years forced them to confront questions about complicity, responsibility, and memory. In the end, the fate of Hitler's secretaries serves as a quiet counterpoint to the dramatic trials of Nuremberg and the executions of Nazi leaders. While men like Göring, Ribbentrop, and Keitel faced justice, the secretaries lived on, carrying memories that no court could punish. They became living witnesses to the banality of evil, the reminder that great crimes are often surrounded by ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. And when they finally broke their silence, their testimonies gave us a rare glimpse into the private world of Adolf Hitler from the inside. So, what happened to Hitler's secretaries after World War II? They survived. They carried their memories in silence, sometimes for decades. They built new lives, often quietly, sometimes in shame, sometimes in reflection. But history never quite let them go. Because when we ask what it was like to be at Hitler's side, not as a general, not as a minister, but as someone who simply typed his words, only they could answer. And in their stories, we find a haunting truth, that evil is not only in the orders given or the battles fought, but also in the silence of those who chose not to see. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my video on what happened to Nazi generals after World War II, and also make sure to hit that like button and subscribe.